and we'll jump right into it. Awesome. So this is an open question. Anyone, there's no idea that's too small or too out there. Everyone is welcome and invited to participate. I want to ask you guys, why do people fund open source projects and why don't they?
I ever thought why they don't fund it.
Okay.
The perception of free means to people who don't fund open source projects that free means, I don't have to pay for it. So it's a misconception of the word free here.
Really good point. But from what I know, there's no free lunch, so somebody pays for it eventually, right? Who pays for it if people don't pay for it?
Right. I understand that's a rhetorical question, but often it's the developer, right? With sweat and tears and countless hours.
Yep.
Well, I think they are reflected in the costs and the quality of the project being.
Can you elaborate, Mark? What do you mean by that?
The projects which are not funded have technical debt, which is unresolved. So recently, 7-zip was discovered. Had discovered critical issue where you could use the malformed package to upgrade to basically execute remote code execution attack. So that's something which could be code before being deployed to production on so many systems if the project would be properly funded, so there could be independent auditor, for instance. So not only the developer pays for it with his free time, also the users pay for it through the decreased quality.
If I could say something, I'm perhaps an edge case, but I've been iterating on an open source solution for the last 10 years. And I think the industry as a whole, they're so used to these patents and IPOs and stuff like that. They need to have ownership of the stuff they're trying to invest or fund. So when you finally go, oh, we're open source and we're going to build this stuff. They're like, oh, okay, just build it. Then you don't get money from us. But as I think open source is much more profitable in the long run, because let's say, okay, the 3D printing got patented. So it's just 30 years of non-collaboration around prototyping is not good. You have one company that got filthy rich by patenting it, but then you see this exponential growth of prototyping once the patent goes out, once it goes open source. So yeah, so just think of it. What would your parents have done if they had access to a 3D printers 30 years ago, and you grew up with it, instead of now teaching your kids about 3D printing? So you kind of got lost in one, what's it called? Yeah, parenthood, whatever. Yeah. So yeah, that's all for me.
Did you mention Blockfrost, Roar?
We're using Blockfrost, yes.
Yeah. Another example of open sourcing patents that I can think of is like Tesla, right? They actually open source all of their patents. And the whole point was if we can, if really like we are trying to, decrease the carbon emission and move humanity forward to a more sustainable future, then, what's the point of keeping all of our technologies, patents, and innovation secret, right? If someone can take what we have done and build it and innovate on it, then they should, right? It's mission-led innovation.
Yeah. So that's actually something that we're building in our solution, our online makerspace. And you can actually create an NFT out of your ID, a blueprint NFT, and people can use it in other blueprints as well. So
awesome.
You get this open collaboration on IDs.
Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else? Awesome. Someone said, yeah, go ahead, Ashton.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm working, doing some contract work for someone, and because I've been thinking about these things more than just the work I'm doing for them, I was trying to think of how to implement solutions for them. But then I'm also very interested in open source, for various reasons. But when it came to the payment aspect of it, there are some problems, and maybe someone here could clarify the best way to approach this. But for instance, how to implement payment solutions that can be open source. Just for instance, in one sense, like if you're making an open source payment solution, then how can someone else retain their own rights to their use of that or implementation of that without giving up the custodian, is what I'm trying to say. At least when I tried to approach him and saying, well, maybe we could make an open source solution for this, he was like, well, that might, he thought those were problems, although he was more of a business mindset. So, that could just be biased. Anyways, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so Ashton, I want to repeat just to confirm, right? There's concern, I think here open source pretty much is free, how Matthias mentioned it earlier, right? There's from business side, and compared to my co-founders, the least technical savvy person, and more on the business side than them. And my concern at the same time was, how can we monetize open source project and code, right? And they have convinced me actually that it is possible, not the open source project itself, right? But services that we built on top of open source. We had many different discussions in the past where, Johnny from IOHK and Patrick mentioned, yeah, open source is a way for me to build my reputation with the open source community, especially when it comes to like super difficult projects that requires expert knowledge. And because of that, then I can build my business based on consulting and building stuff and contributing, because I've already contributed to so many things. For us as a startup, we have open source projects that are just owned by the community, funded by the community, and for the community, right? And then we also have private projects where it's not funded by the community, it's funded by VCs. And, over there, we're making money, right? So, I wouldn't say it's mutually exclusive, right? Because the open source ownership is for the community, but it can be like the baseline infrastructure layer for whatever you are building that you want to monetize, right? It drives adoption, it drives goodwill. It shows what you are standing for, right? Not just guarding your IP, but sharing and building for the common good. Yeah.
Regarding this, this is run. Our solution is run by a company, but I've been looking into how because we're an open source company, and then you have like examples, not to blame anyone, but Thingiverse, they went from open source back to hard school business case. So if you publish a 3D print, they own all the rights to it and stuff like that. So it's we started looking into how can a company be open source. They say they're open source and they stay open source, and building these functionalities around these smart contracts on the blockchain. So if they later on revert or doesn't become open source because they become so profitable, there's a way to stop this progress by the money grabbers. So I think, yeah, this is something that should be looked more into on how open source companies, licenses can stay open source. This is very important because once you get a investor that's all in for the money, they mess up companies all over the place. But if it's hard coded in a smart contract, if you do this, you will lose everything you reached at this point. It will be lost. So you can even have a voting by the community on if the company should not be open source anymore, and the community could vote on the company. So
very cool. Yeah, some kind of governance model,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I think this is something that if you build a company, this is something that should be in place to validate that you will stay true to open source.
Absolutely. I think having something like a DAO that's owned by the community that has funded the project or has built the project of the contributors who decide, I think going back to the meme, right, of starting a collective and giving you financial support, it's the community that will eventually financially support the open source project. Not just financially, but also with governance, kind of like what Catalyst is. It is a community that kind of is self-sustaining and voting on different things that they're gonna fund, what is gonna get funded, what is not gonna get funded. So in this way, similar what can be open source and what will be closed source. Yeah, so let's for the open source licenses, Roar, check out HEPL3. It's a FARO, GNU FARO General Public license. The MIT license is very popular. It's like super open, right? But this one, the GNU HEPL3 is one that we use specifically for our own open source projects. And what that means is, you guys feel free to use it, right, in your own projects. But that project also has to be open source, right? If I'm gonna create a public good project and you're also integrating and using the same source code, your project also has to be open source. So I wanna make sure that the projects that benefit from this also contribute to the public good. Right, so that's one way to protect from, ownership takeover and so on. And then the DAO can, of course, vote on the licenses, but also understanding like governance is super hard, right? But when it comes to governance, that's where ownership happens, and that's when funding happens a lot of times.
I have not looked into it. My brain is elsewhere.
Awesome. Well, we are here to share all the resources together. So I hope it's helpful. Hey Johnny, welcome to the fray.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. We're discussing why do people fund open source projects and why they don't. Any thoughts?
I would like to say enlightened self-interest, but when and sometimes enlightened self-interest, if you look in the case of Linux, 14,000 people contribute, 1,000 people are active core devs, and of those 1,000 core devs, 90% are paid. Why are they paid? Right? They're paid for free to work on free software because companies like Google, like Oracle, pretty much every company in the world depends on it. So sometimes those enlightened self-interest are the enlightened self-interest of their employers and corporate sponsors.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you, Johnny. Yeah, who doesn't use Linux these days in their server in one shape or another, right? I think that's if we have something that we build and it's common good, and it's to really push the whole ecosystem forward, and also if the whole ecosystem adopts it, right, or a large majority of the ecosystem adopts it. So for example, Logan is building smart contracts protocol that's open source, or DAO tooling that's also open source. We're building quadratic voting that's open source, right? Lance building the SSI Roots wallet that's open source. And right now is a small community, but within the Cardano ecosystem, and Johnny, you guys are building like Cardano open source, right? As our projects get successful, or as our small startups now, small teams grow, and as bigger projects adopt this technology into their tech stack, right, they will have vested interest. My interest is to actually get the Fortune 100 companies on the Cardano open source ecosystem, whether through directly integrating the source code, or whether through using tools that would push the open source ecosystem and tooling forward. So, and in that way, I hope we can get more and more funding for open source projects. Do you know by any chance, or does anyone here know by any chance how Linux got so popular with Google and Oracle and so on?
I can't remember his name, but he used to work for Caldera, and he's a Catalyst community member for sure.
Dean Taylor,
Dean Taylor. There you go. Thank you. And it took a really long time to cross that chasm from enthusiasts and early adopters, which I think is similar to Cardano, right? We have a lot of enthusiasts and early adopters right now, and that gap to mainstream took a really long time before people were using and willing to back and deploy Linux at scale, right? It seems so obvious in hindsight and like a natural decision now, but it took a really long time for Linux to see that type of adoption. I have to go back and look at my notes from my conversations with Dean. Give me 1 second.
Yeah. So for those of you guys, I'm sure you guys have heard about enthusiasts, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards, right? It's kind of like the 5 quadrants of marketing and how product gets adopted. There is something called Great Chasm, where whatever you're trying to build, whether it's you know, a new technology or product or just open source tool gets adopted by what's called the early majority, like Johnny explained, like beginning of mainstream, right? I'm sure Cardano is well known somewhat in the blockchain Web3 community now, right? But in the mainstream, it is not yet like the mainstream. So, you know, and in this case, we're talking about developers, right? How can we get more open source projects adopted by the mainstream, whether it's a developer or company? I'll share a picture here in a chat. And if you guys want to check it out, you can. So essentially, Johnny, you're saying we need a lot of evangelists, right? And time. And also projects that provide real value.
Yeah, and well, not just projects that provide real value, but you know, we're talking about, let's switch the focus from Cardano in general to just open source in general, right?
Yeah.
When there's like that tipping point between when somebody says, I'm fine with using this in a free, self-supported way, to when they hit a point where it says, I'd rather just pay somebody else. I'd rather buy this, right? And, you know, typically for admins and developers, you know, managing some environment, that takes a while, and in some cases it may not ever happen. But when other companies and their peers and competitors and everybody else sees the value that they're getting out of it and says, okay, well, it took them, and they have it took them this long, and they have this many people, full-time in-house admin staff dedicated to maintaining and operating that environment, I'm not going to go down that path. I'm just going to pay somebody else to help me. I want to buy this solution, even though it's based on free open source software. I can do it myself, but I'm not going to. It essentially just comes down, it's like any other tool acquisition or software solution acquisition cost, right? Even if it's free and open source, there is a component of build if you're going to roll it yourself, that platform and infrastructure. And if there's enough people depending on it, they would rather just pay somebody to do it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Ribar, did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. It's at least the project we're building is quite intricate because we connect the industry all the way out to the makers, and there's so much investigation that has been done in the project. So you kind of need to be a specialist trying to build it yourself. So, and spending 10 years on it kind of shows that you're in it for the long run. You kind of have these the group of people that actually burns for this solution. So it's yeah.
Yeah, and I okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Johnny. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was able to clarify one other thought about why Linux was able to cross the chasm, and it actually has less to do, in my mind, with Linux itself. It certainly, there was a relevant bit of context there, but it actually had to do with server sprawl and virtualization, I think, more than anything else. and the confluence of factors, right? If you think about the externalities that led to the success of Linux, I would argue that one of them certainly was server sprawl, underutilized servers. At the time, everybody was running Windows servers, and even though it was expensive to run Windows servers, the bigger problem was that if you ran a Windows app on Windows servers, you would have one Windows server per physical machine, right? This is around the time of x86 Wintel machines, right? In a lot of cases, generic pizza boxes, eventually blades, and over time, it was just the realities of economics that drove people to use more and more Linux. But those early adopters had to prove that it could be done, right? And they were just seeing better economic value and density out of using Linux than they were out of using Windows. I mean, ultimately what it came down to. Challenge me on that though, anybody. That's just my my thought.
Oh, I think you're right, Johnny. I think every successful startup rides a bigger wave than themselves, always, right?
Yeah,
Whether it's
and go ahead.
I was gonna say whether it's like a server instability or Windows dominance, right, monopoly, or whether it's like the mobile microtrend, or now decentralization, like blockchain is a huge microtrend, right? And
Yeah.
and in blockchain, like I didn't know myself, but before I entered the blockchain space, but almost every project, every team has an open source component to it. And there's a huge, like, by the people, for the people movement in our industry.
Yeah, because decentralization matters in our industry. Maybe not to a handful of VC shitcoins, right? But if I think there are a couple of macro trends that will play into this, and it has to move beyond just this pushing power to the edges, kind of anarcho technocrat kind of whatever, these, like these communities, because enterprises at the end of the day, they really don't care. They really don't care about that. That doesn't mean anything. And if you look at the trend over the past few years with, toe in the water, I mean, the economics of everybody maintaining their own systems versus using a quorum of hyperledger infrastructure to support critical supply chain and trust networks. The avoidance of legal non-repudiation disputes and everything says, okay, this is a good use case for blockchain, right? But at the same time, private permissioned blockchains in many cases don't have access to the value networks, and the attempts to bridge between bespoke hyperledger deployments and the value networks of all of the potential other suppliers and partners that need to be onboarded to that system. Your mileage may vary when it comes to the success of private permissioned infrastructure like Cordova or Hyperledger, right? And so I think that you will see companies more willing to consider and experiment with public permissionless infrastructure, right? And I think one of the really cool things about blockchain and public permissionless infrastructure like Cardano, Ethereum, et cetera, is when they see the access to the ecosystem, the communities, the people who are already transacting on it, right? That's going to be a big draw. What's interesting is if you look at small individual dApp developers, one of the things I love about public permissionless infrastructure is that it's ultimately a really cool form. dApps are nothing but a really cool form of serverless applications,
Right.
serverless. And it's not that they're serverless, but really they're scale invariant to a certain extent. Not entirely true, because there's all kinds of off-chain infrastructure in certain paradigms that you have to consider. But the small team in MinSwap, right, building their DEX in Vietnam, right, has access to the same application infrastructure, throughput, scale, and economies of scale that the larger teams in, I shouldn't say, I don't know who actually has a larger team, right? But like they have access to this, they have same access to the same infrastructure the Sunday Swap team has, as does the Wing Riders, or as does the ErgoDex, right? Well, actually ErgoDex runs on is something else, but my point being is that if I'm a dApp development team of 2 people, guess what? I'm running on the same infrastructure as the dApp teams with many, many, many more people, and I'm not having to manage that infrastructure. It's the ultimate form of serverless.
It's not just scalability, but maintenance. You mentioned costs, legal disputes, security, right? All of that is there, and knowing that it's not only you that is contributing to this infrastructure, but so many other teams, right? Like no one's gonna get fired for spinning up a Linux server, even though it's it's based on an open source project, right?
Yeah. There's a couple of, and the other factor, though, I think from a crossing the chasm with enterprise is, and we're going to see that happening next, because I see Lance in here, I want to mention it, is integration of identity into this, right? And verified credentials are going to become increasingly and extremely critical, right, to the success of the future adoption of decentralized public permissionless protocols.
Wow, I'm kind of running space on this board. Anybody else want to add here?
I think there needs to be a blueprint on how enterprises can use or swap over to this blockchain technology. So
it kind of depends. It kind of depends on, if you look at adoption patterns for adoption patterns for a number of different open source projects and communities. There are, I think, 3 major ones that I like to generally acknowledge, right? There is the individual developer or small development team scratching their own itch, right? Solving a problem that is really a passion projects, and they nurture it in really from a truly grassroots type of environment to see some sort of adoption and build a community around that, right? The phases of open source project adoption, how you turn an open source project into an open source company, is you start with project community fit, right? You are solving a problem that you have that is interesting to you, and you might not work on it full time, and you have a day job, whatever, but it's a really interesting passion project for you, and other enthusiasts come along and say, that's interesting, you've done all this interesting work already, and since it's free and open source, rather than me starting from complete scratch and reinventing the wheel, I'll build upon what you have and extend to it, submit some pull requests, non-breaking pull requests, and try to help you improve it. And over time, that community grows until the point where somebody might start to run that in production and start to derive real value from it. At that point, you know, you have now solving a problem that people deem valuable enough to achieve project market fit, right? Now, at the stage of project market fit, it becomes a question of how do I increase some metric? You know, what is the telemetry that tells me maybe it's GitHub stars, maybe it's downloads, maybe it's subscriptions or people paying for support, right? But then you refine that when you achieve project market fit, you have to refine that to achieve value market fit. Now, the second kind of motion that I see more common in the Valley is some engineers at Uber or Airbnb or LinkedIn, right, or Netflix, they hit a problem at such a scale that they start to build a library or a solution for a problem that they have in managing their fleet and their infrastructure and their style of development and working within their engineering teams that nobody else has solved or hasn't solved satisfactorily for a very specific set of needs. But because they are engineers at Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, et cetera, there's a good chance that other companies at scale, right, Web 2.0 companies at scale are encountering similar problems. And so they tell their engineering friends at other companies, or they talk to each other on various message boards, or because their GitHub accounts are famous enough and associated with other projects of that type in the past. So it gains a certain kind of traction that way, right? And over time, there's enough success and enough adoption, or a handful of anchor customers, to where they're encouraged by venture backing and venture capital and seed money to take that project during that window of opportunity and project market fit to build a community, right? And then kind of work backwards to achieve bigger project community fit, and then turn that into an open source company. And then the last one is really, if Cardano goes down this path, right, or other major projects that for the most part the code is fully developed, it's basically at the other end where it hasn't necessarily been monetized or it hasn't necessarily become a company, but there's a company behind it, and that company is going in the opposite direction, open sourcing something that is very important, right? So rather than that grassroots bottoms up path to success, and rather than that handful of developers, the whole company saying, hey, we're taking this thing that we've developed and we're going to open source it, right? And you can think of this as in the case of Kubernetes at Google, or whatever, or Kafka from the team at Confluent, which started inside of, right? But again, that was more similar to the second use case. In the case of, Google open sourcing Kubernetes, that's very intentional, and it's taking something that, it's a very conscious, intentional business decision, right? But anyways, I've rambled on for a while, and I think those are the kind of the three patterns that leads to monetization and open source business models today.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for your insights. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There even like the cost of maintaining and building something by yourself. Maybe a project starts off like we have this huge problem and we wonder if there is a solution out there that's open source, right? We go on GitHub to see, okay, is there like a linguist AI library that we can try and see how that works in our language, right? Or is there, like a Haskell library that we can use for the voting? And if not, then we have to build it, right? Now, if it's like kind of like a hobby project, or not like your deliverable project, but you still have this huge issue, it's best to kind of get help from the whole community to help maintain it and build it, and it helps build your reputation as well. Anybody else want to contribute to this? Patrick, welcome. Why do people fund open source projects? Why don't they?
Funding open source projects. I didn't follow all the discussion, first of all.
I know,
so
you just
excuse me.
joined. Awesome. So we're gonna go in the next one. How do we get people to fund and sponsor regularly, right? How can we do that? So crossing enterprise chasm, right? So let me start. You know, and I'll go back to what Johnny said about scratching your own itch, finding the pain point that companies have. One way that I've identified how to get big companies to fund open source project of the whole ecosystem is understanding their pain points, right? Right now, every big tech company is hiring, and there's literally not just not enough developers on Cardano, right? But not enough developers like just in general. And everyone wants to hire like 100, 10,000, even 100,000. Amazon had like hundreds of thousands of developers, but they can't find them, right? And when they can find people with enough experience that have proven you know, projects and so on, and everyone's fishing from LinkedIn, pretty much. Everyone's like, you ask every recruiter, they say, where do you find people? I go on LinkedIn to find people, right? So they're looking at alternatives to get out of that pond that everyone's overfishing, and they go on GitHub. They look at people's source code, literally. And the beauty of GitHub and open source is you can see the code, what people have done. LinkedIn is making literally a bank on selling your data, right? And GitHub, it's there, it's open. Now, and at the same time, right, open source has a huge ability to give people, especially those that are entering and breaking into the tech industry, an ability to build their portfolio, build their experience, build their reputation. So even if someone is like super fresh and new, they can see, okay, hey, I built a bunch of stuff, I have a bunch of commits on GitHub, and that's something even I am looking at as someone that hires people. If we can build a funnel that helps enterprises find more engineers, and even have access to new talent that have recently able to build things, right, and contribute. That is one itch that we can solve. The other one is security, right? With all the hacks that are happening all the time. You know, you guys know about open source bounties, usually bug bounties, they're called, but just generally open source bounties, where, you know, companies already have a ton of work and a ton of vulnerabilities that they need to patch, and not enough engineers to do that, right? So to tap into the developer and open source developer community, to tell them, hey, you know, this is the feature that I want to get built, or this is the problem or bug or vulnerability that I want you guys to find and discover, and I'll pay you to fix it. And in that way, once you put in the money, right? Once you adopt the open source developer or project ecosystem, and once you are able to pay for it, you're much more likely to keep paying and keep creating bounties and keep funding projects.
Yeah, you become a believer.
Yeah.
In open source, and it comes back to enlightening those self-interest, right?
Yep.
And to that point about, at least in the Valley, and Seattle and some other kind of tech centers, it is a mercenary market for top engineering talent, right? And a lot of that stems from early days of Google understanding and recognizing that a really good engineer, right, that has good workflow and focus and everything else can really exceed the productivity. It stems from good engineers at Google and the mythical man month, right? That one good engineer can be as productive as 10 junior ones or 10 mediocre ones. I don't know what the exact statistic or number or ratio is, but there is definitely and has to be a kind of law of diminishing returns to some extent there. And as a result of that, they're also not fishing and arbitraging labor markets and fishing from pools of talented, capable developers in other areas. GitLab in particular is one company that's committed to open source. Their business model is open core, and they are 100% remote and very comfortable with that and proud of that fact. And they talk, and Sribanj, their CEO, talks about that all the time, right? But one thing about working effectively in a fully remote distributed environment is that you have to speak in the tool, have fluency and currency in distributed working styles. And candidly, open source developers that have a good track record of pull requests across projects have proven that, right? Because they're not sitting in an office working on a project and doing things in that. I mean, it's implicit in the work that they're doing, that it's distributed and they're submitting well-formed and quality pull requests for those pull requests to get merged.
Right on. Patrick, I see you're adding standards in there. Matthias, welcome back. You have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I had to put out the fire. Just really one quick, since I see we're on this slide. I had a brief conversation yesterday. So there was my conversation partner was responsible for making an investment into another blockchain-based company on another chain a little over a year ago for $15 million US, just one project, right? So I asked how that investment went, right? And so the answer was, oh, they hired a really great management team. That was it. Meanwhile, we're here in Catalyst, and the expectation is to change the world with 10K, right? So I just wanted to share that perspective a little bit. It seems to me that there's a little bit of we have VC on one side and then open source, and the accountability standards seem to be a little bit different, or perspectives on timelines. I don't know what it is, but I thought that was very funny, and I wanted to share that because I need a little bit humor in my life right now.
It's a good one.
Yeah, I'll try to enlighten you with some humor if I can think of any good jokes. But that's crazy. One thing that is interesting though is that smart money VCs and the good open source companies now are getting all kinds of term sheets. The I don't know, Sierra Capitals, Arrow Capitals, Great whatever Ventures, and A16Z in particular, right? Does all kinds of investments in open source companies. Y Combinator, same thing.
Yep.
Right. So it's not a fringy thing, right? And who is it that when they talked about? Yeah, the guy from A16Z. But you know, when Red Hat IPO'd, I don't know however many years ago, as $1 billion open source company, you know, based on an open source business model, he was so certain that that was going to be the record forever, right? And yet, you know, like less than 20 years later, Red Hat was acquired for $33 billion, right, by IBM. And all around, you look at Mattermost, you look at Streamlit, you look at Maroxa, you look at PostHog, you look at over and over again, you look at all these numerous examples of companies that are, I don't know, Streamlit in particular, what would they purchase by Snowflake for $800 million, right? And so there's money now there, and there is open source is no longer a fringy thing, but just a way of life and a reality now, right? I think part of the challenge, though, that is kind of facing a lot of open source companies is, you know, how to remain like, I think a really good example that's highlighting some of the challenges of the open source industry is the ongoing battle between Elastic and Amazon, between Elasticsearch and OpenSearch, right? Elastic built their business and IPO'd to great success and had a very successful liquidity event IPO, and eventually they got to, and this is a problem for all companies that are building open core business models, is that eventually, or even cloud hosted, eventually a major cloud player comes along and says, we're just going to take the project that you've worked on and offer it as a service on our cloud platform, right? Integrated into our cloud platform. You can point click, you can even use CloudFormation or Terraform to provision a service that Elastic is charging for as an enterprise service. Well, now you don't even have to go through all that stuff. You don't have to deal with Elastic. You can just spin up an Elasticsearch server and a cluster through us, right? And just pay us for the compute costs, compute networking and storage costs. So a lot of companies are responding by modifying the terms of their license to not be so permissive, and doing certain things in the licenses so that companies like that can't, you know, they're basically putting it's basically an anti-cloud provider line in, you know, statements, clause in their license agreements that says only we are allowed to make money off of hosting this open source project, right? And it's split many members of the community, right, of open source movement, and saying, you know, that's kind of not, it's no longer free and open source software, right? And so one of the things that we as an open source movement have to grapple with is having a really clear understanding of that up front. And that's really hard for open source project founders to anticipate, that they'll ever get to a level of success where they'll have to contend with that, right?
That's a good problem to have, though.
It is a good problem to have, but at the same time, sometimes certain open source contributors to these projects, that context switching is that's not what we signed up for, right?
Right.
And so it's pretty well split. And I think more often than not, they understand that, you know, the company that originally, or the team, or the whatever, the community that built the original thing, you know, should have some say in that. So it does come back, a lot of it, to governance, right? But these are just emergent problems that didn't exist 10 years ago.
Yeah, and also to your point, Johnny, 10 years ago, we didn't have, you know, these unicorn open source projects that, you know, prove that it can be done, right? That free is not free, right? But you can build real business models on top of, you know, open source project. And it's just about how to align what you have with what businesses need and pay for, kind of like finding the pain point that they need to solve. It is a good problem to have once you kind of start venturing into governance. My answer for a lot of governance, or my open question, is, can a DAO of the contributors, right? Whoever contributed, and depending on how much they contributed, solve that. And that's yet to see, but it's important to think about these things. We are also building 2 DAOs for our 2 open source projects, right? With Logan, he had to hop off in MLabs. But yeah, I wonder, like, what will come out of it. I will definitely check out Elasticsearch and OpenSearch and read more. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and just just real quickly, so Elastic changed the license terms, and so OpenSearch made a fuss, and Elastic responded, and they didn't allow Amazon to do that. So now Amazon forked the free non-enterprise version of Elastic, created a new open source project. And you've seen this over and over again with what was OpenOffice and Libre, right?
Yeah.
I mean, open source communities. I mean, that's the ultimate kind of measure or test of this, is that eventually communities, if they're not happy with the direction the project is going, and it's an open source project, they can always fork and create a new community around it.
Right.
And if we think about that in that's a fork in open source, in some ways is kind of like a hard fork in crypto, right?
Right.
We no longer agree with the direction that this cryptocurrency is going in, so we're going to take the block producing power and go elsewhere and create our own fork of this.
Yep.
I wanted to add about IBM buying Red Hat. Red Hat was already a company worth like more than $4 billion when it was acquired. And it was a long period that the company was working on the open source. Then at a certain point, IBM chose to buy it for a strategic decision, and to have this kind of acquisition, this kind of interest, there must be somebody that is making. So let's say IBM want to go on open source and sell services about Linux, and Red Hat is like the company that does this. Basically, they were already providing services. So this is like a very big case of an acquisition. But in general, if we look at the low level, we can see that it's more or less the same. There is a company that has a need to enter a market. Maybe they save money or they want to provide new services. Somebody is kind of proposing, showing what this project can do or this company can do. And what I observed is there are open source projects which are using so-called working groups, where there are many small projects that are connected in terms of technologies. And basically, these working groups are acting as a market where the projects are the goods to be purchased. And the buyers, the customers, are the companies that are going there and see what they can shop for their needs. An example that I saw, it was, I don't know, the automotive consortium or many other, but basically what, or I don't know, the software modeling working group. So basically in this open source foundation, I saw that there were a number of working groups. Each working group was kind of participated by companies and was directed by a foundation, but was also participated by projects. And in the project, you have people working in, I don't know, automotive. And for the companies, you have, I don't know, Bosch, Volkswagen, BMW, Audi, etc. And then kind of as a controlling, you have this foundation that is steering basically the direction, making sure that everything is clear. I think the idea of working group is good because a working group, if managed by a foundation, and in our case, we have a Catalyst, which is, you know, it's providing funds, so means if we have this working group that is bringing up the interests of the projects, making sure that the projects are known by the companies, then it will be the best way to align the projects to have the same standards, and also to make sure that these projects are known by the companies that might be interested in the space. And here there is one of the biggest companies in this case is IOG. By the way, the foundation I'm talking about is Eclipse Foundation, which was created by IBM.
Yeah.
When they made open source their product that was called Eclipse. And one of the, I mean, I worked in the automotive sector a little bit, but there are, this working group was not successful because the companies decided to agree on a different tool or system called AutoSAR. So this is an example of a tentative from the foundation that was okay. But the foundation had success in other directions, like the modeling tools, which are still used by the same company. But what I'm saying is a foundation can create multiple working groups, and one for each area of interest. Let's say decentralized identities, or NFTs, or transactions, or whatever. And the companies that are in the space, biggest that I can think now is IOG. But the companies, ideally, they should be in, say, members of the foundation. We should remember that IOG intention, declared intention, is to make a Catalyst self-standing project, if I understand correctly, a self-governing entity. So that the Cardano Foundation should be, I'm not really sure, but my understanding is that there should be an entity driving Cardano that is an entity on itself. And if my understanding is correct, then IOG want to be like commercial/preferential partner on this.
Yeah. So what you're mentioning, Patrick, is a lot of these open source foundations. Let's pick on one in particular, right? CNCF, right? Home of Kubernetes, among a number of other projects, Rancher, things like that. Do you know how much it costs? Do you know what the governance of CNCF looks like? And do you know how much it's a members-based organization too, by the way. Do you know what it costs for to become a member of CNCF?
No idea.
To become a platinum member of CNCF costs, I think, $500,000 for a minimum of 2 years. But that guarantees you a board seat on their technical steering committee and decision board. So in some ways it does, there is a financial element to that. Anybody can contribute to CNCF, make a pull request, right? But if you want to influence, I think, the technical decisions, right, and be that close to it, that's what you're going for. Let me look on the website real quick and see what some of the lower tier memberships are, and what you kind of get for that. But the idea there, though, is that CNCF is a sub foundation hosted and embedded at the Linux Foundation, right? It is a own independent foundation, and the Linux Foundation has leveraged their now if you look at other open source foundations like Apache or Eclipse or Open Infrastructure Foundation, right? Apache does not allow, Apache Software Foundation does not allow embedded sub foundations or sub organizations, and neither does Eclipse, right? Eclipse was founded in 2004, 2006, right? Something around that time, really as a project by IBM to, around the creation of the Eclipse IDE. And it's since taken on a nice variety of different kinds of projects. But each of those projects is just that. It's just a project embedded at the Eclipse Foundation. They don't have their own governance structures. The only governance happens now. They have technical steering teams within that. But another good example is Hyperledger. Hyperledger is embedded at the Linux Foundation, right? And so having some sort of umbrella type of thing to lend that type of expertise and establish governance structures, I think is interesting. The one thing I would say about open source projects for distributed ledger technologies, especially cryptocurrencies in general, most open source projects are only concerned with the code, the technical artifacts, and the roadmap associated with those technical artifacts. Most open source projects don't have a treasury, a running network, and a community already built in. So I think that's going to be a challenge when we talk about governance for open source projects associated with cryptocurrencies, right?
Yeah, Johnny, I think that's a unique opportunity for the blockchain community to actually tackle, to provide this tooling for funding, decentralized funding. Anyone can contribute, whether you're an end user or a developer or enterprise user, right? To be able to contribute and then have a central place where they can have, access to crypto treasury or less.
Yeah.
Right. That's what blockchain is about, like holding value, right?
Yeah. One area though where I think we don't necessarily have the solutions today, but I think you kind of what you need to do is to benchmark and value ultimately driving towards, I think, some notion of proof of merit or some sort of merit token, Gitcoin, whatever it is, right? But and how do you earn that? Is it the number of lines of code modified or the number of pull requests? Not all pull requests are created equal, right? But whatever it is for your contributions to improving the code base, what if your contributions are at the core consensus of the ledger and requires you to understand formal methods and formal verification? You have to have read all these scientific papers. Then shouldn't your contribution be worth a lot more merit? Versus if you're just updating some UI and some buttons and doing things like that, or a style sheet. I'm not trying to make a statement of, right now about what's more valuable than the other, but I think somehow, some way, people would have opinions on what's a more valuable contribution and what deserves more accumulated merit, right? Whatever that proof of merit token is. But I think another way is maybe the governance structures, or whenever there's a bounty or an issue, that you attach a price tag or a value to that,
Right.
or right, and so you have some notion of standardized, and it's fair, it's transparent, it's consistent, and people can earn merit by contributing to the project, and that merit ultimately represents voting power when it comes to decisions around the roadmap or deciding who gets to be on the technical steering committee, things like that, right? None of that actually exists today, right? But I think it's an interesting opportunity for innovation.
Can I ask you one thing? I don't know if you are working for AG, I guess so. But if you know Lars Brugges.
Yes, I do.
Okay. And is he contributing a lot of code, a lot of bounties in this direction, or is more teaching?
It's more teaching, but
what would you consider his impact on the expansion of Cardano?
Quite significant, right? Because we basically have to scale Lars.
Yes, but it's not possible. Let's say if we have this system of tokenization of merit, since he's not taking that many bounties, would not really represent his significant impact. So
no, that's not true. Well, I mean, Lars identifies stuff all the time, and he'll raise an issue and ask, like our Plutus team, hey, I tried this and it was working yesterday and not working in this environment, and and it can't just be pull requests. That's not my point. Okay. There has to be merit allocated to identifying issues. There has to be merit to building developer content, even making the code more navigable, refactoring it, organizing it. That deserves merit.
Refactoring is the hardest thing.
Yeah. All these storage. Right. I mean, my point being, all these things deserve merit, right? It isn't just, who can, it's not, at some point though, we have to be able to standardize and normalize so that it is free, consistent, fair, consistent, and transparent. That is a tenet, a central pillar and premise of open source. Why open source works is because it has to be transparent and I don't know. I mean, maybe consistent isn't a hard and fast requirement, right? I don't know if I would maybe take off consistent.
Now, because I want to conclude.
Fair and transparent is what I would say. Fair and transparent.
So now let's say that we start with a system in which we use bounties for everything. And remember that the bounty, we are basically adding an additional layer. We are adding one formalism more, which you have to remember to add an item that is a bounty and blah, blah, blah. Now, what I expect happens for human nature is that even the best developers, or many developers, will probably just don't add a bounty just to their work, push something. And I believe that on the long run, we might end up adding bounties only for code. I think this could happen. What we were thinking in a team, we have a funded project, is like, how are we going to distribute the rewards? And so we decided that a percentage of what we get goes to the team, and another percentage is chosen by the team to all the other people. Let's say that, I don't know, the four of us are working together. And then I say, oh, for your, I don't know, the part that I can allocate, I can say 100% for me. So, or I can say, well, for your great contribution, I think Johnny should get 50% and Ninh should get 50%. That way, I'm allocating away this amount from me. But I'm doing something that is, I think, positive. Or
yeah,
we use it also for other purposes, like somebody has not a job, say it's transitioning out of their day job to, that's also on a need basis. But I think we were discussing this, and we, as a team, we were thinking that this could be one of the purest form of feedback on the work compared to others, because you are actually allocating money. And I learned when I was studying the university, I discovered that the psychologists, they do tests on you, and they use a small amount of money, very small amount of money, because it's more realistic, the result. So I was thinking maybe if we could have a system. You talked about a three-structure organization. So let's say that everybody agrees that Cardano has a value 100%. But let's say that in Cardano there are three branches, just saying decentralized identity, NFT, and the blockchain. And then let's say that the people, they assign 80% of the value. I'm just throwing numbers. 80% to the blockchain, 10% to NFT, 10% to the centralized identity. And then basically the idea would be, if we have a fluid system at which each node can split the value of what is funded on the top, based on what are the needs of the market. Let's say that the next month IOG comes over and say, hey, I really need to push decentralized identity. And therefore, I want that 30% of the budget that I put as a company is allocated to the ID. And then let's say that IOG and the other companies the next month are allocating, instead of only 10% of the total, I don't know, 20% of the total to this branch. So my idea was, what if we have the stakeholders saying, I want to allocate this on this branch, this technology, and on a single project, the people collaborating on the projects are giving a value. Let's say, I know that this month I didn't do nothing because I was allocating and you did all the work, so I will assign 100%, 50 and 50 to you. That was just a proposal. That's it.
I love it. I think it's beautiful. It reminds me of that story of, I forget exactly which company it was, but they had to reduce the workforce, and all of the employees got together and said, well, why don't we do it to where certain people take vacation, certain people who can afford it, certain people, so that we rotate and everybody takes a, what's take some time off or furlough, so that nobody actually has to lose their job. And they all shared the sacrifice, and those who could bear the burden more took on more of the burden, right? And those who couldn't, you know, made sure it was beautiful, right? And I forget the name exactly in the company, but this is truly community consensus, social consensus driven, right? I believe in that, but I think that we need to provide better guardrails, right? I think that the angels of our better nature, as Charles likes to refer to them, that's like the most equitable system I can think of. But how we do have to think about context in which it might be gamed, and devil's in the details in terms of how we we implement that. But I do think that directing, it's profit sharing, it's consensus, social consensus driven, merit sharing, right? I
Merit
think
sharing. I like the word. I remember you created it.
no, you created it. You helped me create it just now. So yeah.
Love the light bulb moments, gentlemen. Keep going. I'm just listening.
I can say the reason why I joined this channel is actually this the guardrails. Since we built this through an enterprise, and I pay from my own wallet the developers on the project, I kind of need to understand properly how to open source the whole thing, and because during the years before, I spent so much time trying to get people to help build me this solution, and it's like cash is king. Nobody wants to work for free, and it's so hard to get help. So that's why this push from an enterprise solution into open source all in is why I'm here. So I was trying to follow this chat, but really what I just want is do this, and okay, I'll do that. Keep it simple.
Yeah.
And
and look, my role even within IOG is constantly evolving. Everybody does, at a certain point, you have to put your business in, and I love that this about my role at IOG is I have to put on my business and my community hat, right? And it's not just about what I can contribute myself, but how I can listen and how I can better sense and respond, right? To maybe conduct, orchestrate, navigate different parts of a very complex social dynamic, right? While dealing with certain commercial realities. And I have to be really careful, right, in what I say, but, I part of my selfish interest in participating in these types of forums is, look, I'm going to have to hire, right? I'm going to have to help figure out the people who hire the people who want to help solve this problem in a really real and practical sense. So, why not start with the people who are thinking about it and talking about it, right? And it's a unique set of combinations, right? I mean, like whenever, I think one of the hardest things, for example, right now to have to hire for in our industry is developer experience or developer relations, right? Or evangelist. Because if you take somebody who's really good at writing code, building stuff, and being an engineer, and you tell them now that their job is to help make other engineers more productive or teach them things like that, it's just like the thing about engineers is they like solving the problem. They like doing the engineering work, right? They don't want to do all that other stuff. But every now and then you're able to find that unicorn that is able to understand what other developers struggle with when it comes to moving into an ecosystem and adopting it. And if you can find that person and they can help make all the other developers in the ecosystem better and more productive, right? That's, it's a really rare treat. So,
yeah.
But Rora, I'm sorry, because I want to go back to, spend a little bit of time. I want to help. What is the specific pain point that you're struggling with right now? Like, what a solution would look like X or look like Y, right?
Yeah, my pain point is I'm not a developer myself. I'm more the solution architect behind it all.
Okay.
I need the money to hire developers to build it for me. So that's my pain point. That's money. Back in 2018, I have to put everything on ice. And I started working as a test lead for a wind turbine simulation software company. And yeah, it's just recently I quit my job and I started working on this project again, all in. So mostly because ADA went up and I can afford developers. So that's the history. And I'm happy for that. So yeah, they give me some and I give it all back. So it's a good ecosystem for that. I started, yeah, I asked for funding back in Fund 3, but I haven't gotten any. So I'm still trying. But yeah, let's see in Fund 8.
Is Youblob open source?
Not the initial code. We haven't open sourced that, but all the functionality that if a maker posts something on Youblob, it's available for everyone.
Hey, Roar, if you're doing it open source, once you guys decide to do that, hit me up. You know, we're building the funding ecosystem on Cardano natively to fund open source projects. As long as you can get people to donate to you through crowdfunding, I can bring enterprises to donate some more money as well.
Yeah.
And if you need developers, right? Just as long as you have the cash to build, you just post a bounty and get your work done.
Yeah. So
I think it's an interesting idea.
You want to join?
No, I cannot. Honestly, I'm leaving a job, entering another one next week, and I don't have time.
But okay, so.
But I know how much hard it is to find a Plutus developer, and you know, from the website, I cannot really find a simple way to understand your idea, your business proposition.
Yeah, I'll send it in the link. The
that
chat.
should be in the website. Just suggesting.
Let me see. This one.
Awesome.
Sorry, didn't mean to sidetrack.
Yeah, I didn't mean to promote my
Thank
solution here, but it's part of this going from enterprise into this and not stepping over these guardrails that we're trying to build. So
yeah, glad you could join, Roar, in a very interesting project and business you're building. It makes me think of makerspace, right, on blockchain. Awesome. Guys, we're over 90 minutes actually. I want to just get a quick pulse check. Do you guys want to contribute more, or should we call it and do another town hall in like 2 weeks? How do we feel?
Yeah. The way I contribute is I ask a lot of questions, and also towards Atala Prism program and stuff like that, because I need to understand all the functionality that they're building and trying to use best practice towards the solution we are building. And yeah, you notice that a lot of things are still in the development, so it's we're getting there. Just
awesome.
Takes time.
I have
one thing I suggest, Ninh, is like we had a handful of us have kind of really done the most of the talking. I mean, but there's like other folks in the breakout room. I don't know if we can maybe ask for go around, and if anybody else has anything to contribute or just thoughts and comments on, you know, where the conversation has gone so far.
Good point, Johnny. Anybody else in the room? I know a couple people just joined us from other breakout rooms. I know Frank, Beatrice, James, Josh, Justin. We have the Crypto King with us. Feel free to unmute yourself or put your thoughts in chat.
Hey guys, I'm sorry I'm a bit late. Can someone just catch me up on what the current project is and what we're talking about?
So hey, welcome. We're discussing how to get people to fund the open source ecosystem, fund and sponsor it regularly. We discussed everything from crossing the chasm to enterprise adoption to scratching your own itch to Roar's awesome new proposal, to governance, how to measure impact. Yeah, it's an open question right now. Yeah, any thoughts on how to get people to fund open source projects on a regular basis, right?
Okay. Is this similar to what I saw yesterday with Fluid 7, or is this a different set of proposals?
It's not a proposal, Crypto King. It is a discussion, exchange of ideas, where I think of this really as a think tank where me and Johnny and Patrick and the community gets to brainstorm together to solve a common challenge, right? Open source is generally underfunded, overconsumed, people, developers burning out, like Johnny's hiring, I'm hiring, everyone's hiring developers, and developer advocates are in super high demand at the same time, and that all creates a tragedy of commons for the open source ecosystem. So we're brainstorming what are the successful paths, what are the successful open source projects that have gotten funding in the past and that have crossed the chasm, right, so to speak. What crossing the chasm means is going from early adopters, early enthusiasts to early majority, to hitting the mainstream, getting companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon to adopt, and to provide sustainable funding and lifeline for any open source projects.
Okay, I get it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a bit like Microsoft. You have to build a business first, and then you can open source it. It's like a two-edged sword. I don't know. It's
actually, Roar, I want to challenge that, right? I used to be like that, right? Let's have a business first and then open source it. There's definitely like two schools of thoughts, right? One is, okay, we need to make money, and the other school of thought is, let's build something that people love, and then money will come. In my last startup, we actually have pivoted the product itself at the beginning in the first year, four times, because we thought, oh, okay, enterprises will for sure buy our stuff, right? Because we have a senior director of engineering from Samsung and an engineering manager from Samsung, and I was an engineer from Google, and we're like, yeah, like just logos on our profiles, people will buy. And then we figure out, no, they don't care actually, because they don't have this pain point. So the product has changed, right? And then we got real lucky that we started building a solution for enterprise hiring, just for the end user to find people, right? Find developers, find whoever you need to find, right? So Johnny, if you need some people, I can generate you a list of people that you can reach out to hire, right? But that started from the end user, right? And we built
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but my concern is also the quality that's being branched into the system. So yeah.
Of course, you have to reach product market fit, right? And the best way to do that is going and collecting feedback and testing with the user. Eventually, not just the one recruiter that loved it, but they introduced us to many different companies, like Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and probably half of the Fortune 100 companies were our clients. Quality you get over time, but you have to build something that people want and need. If you build something that people love, money will come. And same for any project, whether it's closed source or open source, right? I'm exploring now how to do it with open source, right? Is right now like 48% of catalysts are concerned about the whale effect in voting. Is quadratic voting a potential answer, right? So I have to go and ask people, talk to them.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback up that, UX research is a must.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
James, you want to expand on that? What's UX research?
Oh, geez. Yeah, I can go on. This could be a whole nother topic that we could go on for hours. Unfortunately, I don't have the time. But with any project, whether it's open source, whether it's closed source, it does not matter. You need to have the UX research done to know exactly what your clients want. Because you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars building what you think is the ultimate product, right? That everybody's going to love. But if you haven't done any UX research, then you're just building for you and you're spending all that money for you. The UX research part of it is basically letting the end user tell you exactly what they want. Then build that. Okay. Always focus on the UX research first. It's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of money in the long run.
I think it depends. If it's a business to customer and you have a lot of customer, makes sense. But if it's a business to business, not always you need UX, and I'm talking about user experience, such as. So I think is extremely important, because the same product on the back end, different UXs, that it changes totally. So, but when you go business to client, it's more about UX. When you go business to business, what I observed is often you use services, or you just agree on features, and typically you want to achieve the minimum viable product, and you try to cut on the UX.
I will definitely challenge you on that, but we could do that another time. I do understand where you're coming from now. But yeah, so I would say, oh, sorry. Is it Matthias? You had your hand up. You're muted. Matthias.
Switching audio.
Gotcha.
Switching audio. This is better.
We hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, right? Technology. Please finish your thought first. That's what I wanted to say. And then I jump in with something else. But now the flow is totally interrupted, but please.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so for the B2B UX, right? I've done quite a bit of B2B UX in the past, whether it's working with various Fortune 100 companies or various smaller mom and pop shops, whatever the case may be. Then the full spectrum. The good thing about doing UX research in there is not only to help figure out your pricing, it's not only to help figure out your market fit and what features you have that others don't. It's also going through and saying, okay, all these companies have these features what's going to separate us, right? What do we need to add or remove that's going to separate us, that's going to make it easier for the end user, which is these companies, to utilize our product over anyone else's. It could just be cost. It could also just be your feature set. It could be how the data is handled. There's all kinds of different things, and you can learn all of that in UX research.
I think as an engineer, you just want to see all the functionality come to life. So they're a bit all over the place, but yeah.
Yeah, the prototype of your vision, and I think it's a little bit different. I was going to say that, you know, it is very different. You have to have the hypothesis, that intended user, and whether it's, you know, and we typically say, like, you know, developers, right? If you're building something for developers, it's very different than if you're building something for consumers. Is very different than if you're building something for enterprise, right? And, you know, and it's not just developers now, it's data engineers and data scientists. There are companies like Streamlit, Moroxa, et cetera, that are very focused on those specific personas, and simplifying their workflow and streamlining that and understanding at a very intimate level day in the life. And it's interesting because if you're building stuff for developers, right, they could, and it's open source, they can come in and help you improve the solution, give you feedback at the level of the code, which is really kind of unique and interesting. And then, you know, I think, and actually there's even a new category right now that has kind of it was traditionally overlooked, and it's a new market opportunity for building solutions specifically for academic and scientific community, right? Or you know, in the case of, right, what Matthias is doing with Loxe, right, is you know, even different professions that traditionally personas and professions that were kind of, you know, maybe it was too hard, or maybe it didn't have the right context or tools, but, you know, those user experiences I think are pretty interesting, new opportunities, and for not just for the solutions you build, but where in the prototyping product creation process they get involved. And then in the case of developers and data scientists, they can literally make a pull request as a customer or a user. They can be a contributor, all one and the same, right? But if you're dealing with like an enterprise line of business user, really open source means nothing to them. They don't care. They want a solution to a problem, right? And whether it's hosted, whether it's open source, none of that matters. Now, some consumers might prefer open source or various monetization models, premium, subscription, whatever. But I do think those are the three major segments that, and it is that will determine very early on what is your, you know, model to, at what point do you try to release something. And I think at least if you're developing for open source to a very tech savvy community, you can either go one of two ways. You can either try to wait till your prototype, your version 0.1 or version 1 is perfect and ready for market, and you get to test your hypothesis at that point, or you can have just a library or UX or a mock or a stub or a concept. You know, there are two ends of the extremes. And I think if you're targeting tech savvy people, you can err towards that release very early, right? Before it's a finished or mature or refined product. So that's just something to take into account.
So, Johnny, I'm going to agree with you on that last point, right? If it is something that's geared toward developers and developer use only, I certainly agree. You know, you can launch it out really, really early to get feedback and stuff like that, and you can have them help drive, right? But if it's anything that's enterprise or if it's anything that's consumer, you do need to have that UX research stuff done prior to that markup and prior to that beta stage.
Yeah,
Yep.
no, I'm with you.
So sorry, Matthias.
Matthias has had his hands raised for a while.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, since we're on the topic, before I forget, and I'll just bitch about it in the next fund again, because that's been happening. I don't know a great place, but since we're on the topic, I would really love if we could help IO a little bit. And you can possibly, if it's feasible, open source the various voting apps, because the user experience is really bad. And it's every fund, it's a different surprise. What is it going to be this time? Is caching going to be there? Is the search going to work? Is all these kinds of things. So I guess I would like to encourage to think about open sourcing that application for Android and iOS and whatever you have, or even open a standard, whatever you do with your sidechain, so that we could potentially even do our own voting app. But I think there's a good opportunity to utilize the community to build a improved voting tool.
Yeah. Well received, Matthias.
Great, thank you.
Crypto King, you got your hand up. Thank you, Matthias.
Can I just expand on what you all are saying and go back to Matthias's point as well? I think when creating for developers, developers each have their own different areas of expertise or fields they specialize in. I'm not sure if user experience would vary in fields. For example, in certain fields, I might want certain pieces of functionality on certain screens to be more readily accessible than in other fields, just depending on what I'm doing. So it might be a nice idea just to open source the code and allow developers to make custom front ends and allow multiple front ends being actually developed by the end user, taking that burden off the company and kind of putting it on the person who knows what it would be best for, and allowing them to specialize it and tailor it to their own needs while you still make your profit from the back-end infrastructure. And if we can open source the stuff, maybe it's a good idea to let the community just pick different, construct different versions of the voting app for themselves, and all this kind of links back to the same governance protocol for the system. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah. And candidly, the folks over working on ADAO and other similar types of projects are trying to address that from a community tools perspective. It's not my, I will defer to Harris and the product managers working on a voting center governance at IO. But I suspect, and I'm not speaking from a position of authority or anything like that, but I suspect that one of the challenges is the value at risk and the adjacency, because when you're building voting, and I'm totally for open sourcing, right? And I think that's ultimately where everything's going anyways. But I think from a integration, from a build and deploy, there is that touch point into, it all comes back to value at risk, right? And so there does have to be, more scrutiny, and I think that open source is a great way to achieve that, right? Faster innovation, more diversity of thought, better reliability, and just I think so. But I think at least for the V1 or V2 of what is on the roadmap for this year, I think there has to be get to a certain point where there is at least enough capture of the essence, the intention of what it kind of should be, right? And then I think after that, I think it does make sense to completely open source everything.
Awesome. Thank you for the insight, John.
I agree. Iterating on a project for 10 years, this solution is not just like an online makerspace. We kind of have a further path ahead that we're trying to achieve. And it's like when we ask for funding. I had a guy working for me, and he worked 3 months before he tapped my shoulder and said, this project is revolutionizing. And it's kind of, it's so big that you kind of don't want to open sources yet. The plan is actually to enable Industry 5.0, but in order to get to Industry 6.0, we open source it and let users create new solutions around it. That's why we're not patenting anything, because we want to keep it open and help build a better future. So it's a big project, that's all. And open sourcing it, you would get so many different variances of the solution with different baselines that wouldn't benefit where we're trying to go. So
awesome. I want to give space for Patrick. He has his hands raised.
Hello. So I basically have 2 points. The first is to connect with Matthias about open sourcing. That I think the key is standardizing what is used by everybody for the common good. As long as open sourcing is not in contrast with the core business decision of an enterprise. And open source, okay, as long as it doesn't hurt. And the example is, like I wrote in the chat, if the best practice for each Cardano blockchain application is to use WebAssembly, because it typically lives in a browser, instead of the Plutus application backend, which probably does not live in a browser, it doesn't. Then just release an example and make clear that this is the best practice. You don't need just one best practice. You can have a set of. And I think that this is strongly connected to my second point. One of the key factors for success of open source is sharing success stories. And I have a clear example. In my master thesis, I wrote a graphical editor to design cryptographic systems based on Eclipse. So the students of the course, they draw a cryptographic system, and the application generates the Java code, whatever. This was possible because somebody else shared his success stories. Somebody that was creating this Jeff project, graphical editing framework project, shared a few slides on a conference. The slides are really easy to consume. Like 30 slides was nothing for me at the university. Was just looking at this, the first 5 or 6, you understand the concept. You see, maybe I can use it, let's try. And then the following slides, you kind of dive into details, get to the references. And my professor, not anymore here, but was super happy. And I was the happiest because I made him happy. So the point is, that was the first time I observed sharing success stories as a key for success. And then I saw this also after. So what we have now, we have like meetings where everybody shares his own story of success for the business. And this can be very good because if you have a business and you see another business that succeeds, say, not bad, let's try it this way. But you want to do also the same for the developers. You want to have, like my greatest, the most beautiful thing was that I could, I don't know, in 2007, I could search Eclipse, RCP, file type PDF or file type PowerPoint, and I was finding this whole lot of presentation. That was really good. And for this, you need to sponsor. I think this is probably missing in Cardano now. Technical conferences, because if you have a lot of people from different backgrounds joining a technical conference and making their the sum of all their knowledge in a 35-minute slot, they are going to produce probably 20, 30 slides, present for this, 35 minutes minus 10 because they need to do stuff. And then everybody else can go and consume a very specific topic. And this is what I can only dream, because what happens is, if you are a professional, if you are a company, you want to go there and show that you know about this stuff and you can provide these services. And if I'm a developer that I'm interested in the technology, I probably go there and search for your PDF and try to learn from it. And that was the quick way to get into. And then this knowledge is always updated, because next year you get newer technologies. You know that, from one year to the other, there was an injection, a framework for injecting dependencies and stuff like that. So I think this was very powerful. Sharing success stories, standardized or open source, what is used by many people for common good without hurting the business, and having a lot of material that is available.
Thank you, Patrick. Crypto King.
Yeah, I wanted to point out an expansion of what we said previously. So in the Cardano community right now, a good example of the standardization practice is talking about multiple best practices is fractionalization of NFTs. So I think every marketplace is trying to fractionize their NFTs independently and optimize it for their particular store. But in order to make those work on other not other chains, but on other marketplaces, at some point that needs to converge into a universally accepted standard. I think similar things are going to happen back end of wallets. So why don't we just let the marketplace mechanisms determine the best practices required for as much of it as we possibly can, and just build the central infrastructure that needs to be built in a decentralized way?
I'm with you. Market-based solutions, right? I think right now it's just the candidly it's just resource constraints. That's why we're talking about open sourcing, bringing more people into the community. This is, and I go back to kind of one of my principles is blockchain is hard. And the volume of good ideas far exceeds the amount of engineering talent available. And I think at least in the case of IOG, we're solving problems at the bedrock base layers. In spite of the fact that we have a Cardano DeFi Alliance now, I know there have been multiple nascent efforts to launch NFT guilds, NFT alliance, or efforts to bring creators together, but they're also busy in their own right, driving innovation and capturing the market opportunity as it presents itself now. That there's just not enough time and cognitive bandwidth left at the end of the day for them to come together and work on standards, even though we all know it's sorely needed, right? So that's an opportunity for you, Crypto King, right? Bring those people together. help them formulate the standards. We need
No,
leadership too.
yeah. This is the kind of point I'm making, and I think it's exactly what I said. If we have a lack of really talented developers, which we do, why not let them concentrate on the essential infrastructure that's necessary to the core product, but let the user interface and all that boring stuff that doesn't really need very talented developers, that can be done by someone who's rather new to code, as long as they have an API into the background set, offsource that into the community. And yeah, they might take a while to get there, but just take that as growing pains, leave it to them, and build the stuff that's really going to push the blockchain forward at a faster rate, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of the issues of not open sourcing something is also documentation, right? Yeah, I can open source it for you, but if you don't, like, it's a lot of code and you don't have time to process it, then I have to also support the open source community, right? I have to provide the documentation, the support, and you're gonna have questions and so on, which I already don't have bandwidth for. And therefore it's more convenient not to open source, right? That's one of the examples. I'm not saying that specifically one company or another is doing it, but for sure it's true for some of our project. Like, we want to open source a lot of stuff, but we can't, just because, you know, like the documentation internally is barely there because we're building, right? And there's so much to build. Hopefully with finding more resources and being able to bridge the gap into enterprise, right? Like, that's something that Johnny mentioned earlier, like, you know, he is part of IOG, but, you know, for example, on the voting app, he's not the head of product there. So he doesn't, you know, he wouldn't be the decision maker on that, right? The open source voting. Same at our company. Like, I have 3 co-founders. They all have different areas of ownership that they have decisions over. And to understand, to be able to sell to enterprises and knowing who to talk to and what pain points they specifically have, right, in order to provide a solution that they could buy, and so fund resources towards the ecosystem is critical, right? And that's enterprise sales or sales engineering, right?
I agree. And here's the reason I say to do it this way in face of those problems is pretty much because if you do it, just don't put any resources out there in terms of documentation. Let people generate their own documentation. Really, developers would eventually come to the conclusion that it's going to save them time in the long run if they document this stuff out. And it's probably going to, over a long period of time, but still over a period of time, be developed independently from the company and not cost your business any resources or time to develop, but you still have the utilization capabilities of it. If that makes sense.
That does make sense. In the ideal world, for sure, right? Other developers, the community would like go for it and do it. I'd say probably with the voting app, there's probably other reasons besides just the documentation, right? But for us, we're like, you know, a small team that, and everyone needs developers, right? And when by the time that my developers are done, by the time, I'm just looking at the chat, so funny. By the time that the developers are done building, right, they're, you know, they're kind of maxed out on their brain cells, and they need to also take breaks. They're like, we're all humans, right? Now, I do agree with you. When you open source early, eventually something will happen, right? Something good will happen. But at the same time, I've seen people get angry at the company because there's no documentation. Like, what is this? It's like a pile of garbage. Nothing works. Take for example, many developers that are learning the Plutus right now. They all complain, oh, the documentation is so outdated. There's like 2 or 3 versions of it, right? And I heard it from some of the mentees that we mentor, right? And there's like easy solution. There at least is a up-to-date solution, up-to-date documentation that we can point them to, right? But you don't know what people do with the documentation. They can create multiple versions that confuses people, not just one, right? So, you know, the world is a little bit more complicated than that, and there's much to consider for sure. Yeah, Matthias?
I am totally agree with you, right? To properly open source a project, documentation is a must, right? That is one of the reasons why we haven't closed out our RST project, because, you know, we said open source it. That also means documenting it. Like, how can you use a revenue share token in your own projects, right? Absolutely. Now, and it is a complex issue, but I think for like very, very important applications like the voting tool, right? One approach could be, instead of spending resources at I/O to document everything, right? Maybe, I don't know how it looks, right? Maybe the developers internally just know where things are, right? What to change where. So my assumption is that a open source community could figure that out as well. So if you just open source the document and how to build it, have it, or just have a huge disclaimer saying it's like, the community asked for this, sorry, we don't have the resources right now to properly document it, go figure it out. Here's an issue that says write documentation, or probably a couple of various different types of documentation, right? That could be just an incremental approach. And why I do believe the danger is there that, you know, I mean, you see it all the time, that you put yourself out there, you'll get criticized, no matter what it is. So there will be negative backlash, but I think, I mean, that's a decision that, you know, of course, IO has to make, but I do believe that it's worth thinking about it, having an incremental approach. If there's no documentation yet, make it make it a task. That's how I got one position as a CTO, because I knew they were using Happy.js, and I looked at the framework back in that time. I was like, man, this documentation sucks. Let me contribute to this, right? And, you know, now all of a sudden I was a Happy.js expert. And I never used actually the tutorial that I wrote for that, which has been deployed on because it was about rendering views, right? We just used it as an API backend. So I think there's great value in that. So
I want to build upon this by saying the Plutus stuff. So I complain that it's harder to learn Plutus than it would be to learn Plutus if I had better documentation and a standard source. But at the same point, I'm content to say it's easier to learn Plutus with community-based documentation than it would be with no documentation at all. So I'm still suggesting that it would be possible and plausible and a better benefit than nothing. And open sourcing will be a faster route with more specialized interests doing it their way. So, and it'll take the burden off IO, and they can focus more on building out the next version of Plutus and the bigger things, rather than a small application, and free up those developer hours.
Yeah, you know what? I have to tread carefully here, right? Because I am a little bit aware of what's happening behind the scenes, and I don't want to get ahead of anything. One thing I will say is that we have to keep in perspective of less than a year ago. It's been less than a year since we launched smart contracts, right? Less than a year ago, we didn't have a user community And now we have over 900 people building dApps on Cardano. And we understand the criticality, urgency, and importance of doing all of. We have a roadmap and a path to improving that situation. And I feel it candidly just as much as you do. I'm the type of person where I'm, like I used to be an engineer, programmer, developer, architect. And it's one of those things where as I was architecting solutions more and more, I was writing less and less code, and I hate it. Right. And I really haven't written code in a while. And I'm finally at a point where I'm at that breaking point where I'm biting the bullet and I'm going in and learning Haskell and Plutus myself. And it is, as an imperative, recovering imperative programmer, I'm the type of person, just so that you understand my pain is, I was like, if I really want to learn Haskell properly, I got to teach myself lambda calculus. I want to make sure I get the fundamentals right and really understand pure functions and monads and everything else like that. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I've committed to just setting aside, 2 hours every day, no matter what, to, spend time reading and coding and hacking and figuring my way through this. But where we're at in our journey, I do think the tooling, the documentation, and it is not, and trust me, as head of open source at IOHK, I more than anybody am kind of pounding the pulpit for turning and implementing a lot of these ideas, and trust, I'm your man on the inside advocating for these things, right? And I guess that's all I can really say about that. I feel your pain.
Johnny, I'm just grateful that we have a man on the inside. And any time you need any help or any support from us, right, from the community, please reach out. I believe that anyone here would be more than happy and willing to hop on a call and lend a hand, right, voluntarily. That goes without question.
Thanks.
Awesome. So amazing people. We are at 2 hours, 21 minutes. Not that I mind the time. Just just want to celebrate that. I think all the other breakout rooms are done. I wanted to take a quick pulse check. Right? How are you guys feeling? Okay, gotta run. Thank you all for joining. Let's call it a day. It's a good stopper. Johnny, Patrick, Matthias, Crypto King, hopefully one day we'll get to know. I'll follow you. I'll chase you down. And James, thank you guys so much for spending the time with us and digging deeper into the issues. Feel free to leave your contact info here. This will be shared in Swarm with the community. Yeah, and I look forward to hopefully next time. Should we revisit some other open source topics?
I'm open for that.
Yeah,
Awesome.
sounds fun. If you guys want to get me, best place will be on Twitter. My Twitter handle is EUTXO_legend.
Cool. Crypto King, put it on the chat. I'll also share the chat with the community. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for joining. This wraps up the how to fund the open source ecosystem. Have a great, wonderful rest of your day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.